Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is a beautiful Thursday morning. Welcome to Everything Cooperative. My name is Vernon Oakes, and this program is brought to you by the National Cooperative Bank, giving you the information that you might want to know about so you can understand cooperatives, the benefits of cooperatives. And we're celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of NCBA, the National Cooperative Business Association. They got started in 1916. And today we have on the line with us Mrs. Margaret Lund, L-U-N-D. Good morning, Margaret.
Good morning, Vernon.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. How about you?
I woke up this morning. I'm fantastic. Yep. Sun's up, I'm up. Hey, you're up. We're good.
Yeah.
You know, the International Cooperative Alliance has a motto that cooperative enterprises build a better world. And this month, we're celebrating Women's History Month. At least that's what NCBA is celebrating in their 100th year. And so a question for you, being a woman, do you have any sense of how cooperatives have helped women? And it seems like there's a lot of women in the cooperative movement, like yourself. Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense why that's so?
Well, I think there's lots of reasons. I mean, it goes back to the Rochdale Pioneers. They were one of the first organizations that let women be members, organizations of their type. And I think that the democracy and equity and equality all speak to a wide participation by a wide number of people, all kinds of people. And that's one of the great things about co-ops, I think, is how they work for many different people in many different situations. I know in other countries, agricultural co-ops have been incredibly important for women farmers. In developing countries, they've been important here, all kinds of ways, and not just typical. I mean, you know, I think of daycare co-ops or things like that, but also consumer co-ops. Lots of women, I mean, farm co-ops, you think those are farm families and women farmers that are very actively involved in a number of those co-ops. So I just think that, and, you know, the idea of working together for a common good is something, you know, that makes sense to lots of people, including lots of women.
So how did you get involved in co-ops? Well,
that's a good story. I'm I was like born into it.
Okay.
My dad, I grew up in Minnesota, and my dad was involved very early on the board of what was then called Group Health, which was an early healthcare co-op. It's still around. It's now one of the largest providers of care in Minnesota. It's called Health Partners. And it's no longer a co-op because in Minnesota, all health plans have to be nonprofits, so they switched their status. But it still is a consumer-governed board, and way back when, and they started out really as wanting to be a co-op. It was a really interesting story about a credit union guy and an ag co-op guy and somebody else thinking there's got to be a better way to do healthcare and kind of creating a consumer-governed organization. So my dad was on that board really early on, from like the early 60s, and then he worked for them the last 10 years of his career, and he was on the co-op, early co-op bank board. He was on the subcommittee of the early co-op bank that eventually became the National Co-op Bank, the Development Corporation, and now Capital Impact Partnership. So I remember driving, you know, we'd drive way out of our way to go to the co-op gas station. I remember when I was in college, I went to college on the East Coast, and my dad was in New York for a co-op bank meeting. And so he invited me. I was going to school in Philadelphia, take the train up to New York, and all my friends said, great, you know, what did you do with your dad? Did he take you to a Broadway show? Did he buy you some shoes? You know, what did you do? And I was like, well, we went to visit Co-op City in the Bronx. So we went to visit all these housing co-ops in New York, and that's what my dad took me to do for fun in New York City. So it was kind of a part of my growing up, or part of a background. So I think I always knew about it, and then I first chance I got, I took a job that was involved in the co-op sector, and I had that job actually for quite a long time. I ran a loan fund for co-ops in the Upper Midwest for about 16 years. So I was a small business lender to co-ops, and that was I got to work with lots of different kinds. So that's kind of my origin story in the co-op movement. I just kind of grew up around those ideas.
So somewhere when I was researching you, I found out that in your education, though, you were working on a master's or something, and either you wanted to study co-ops, but advisors were leaning you toward, was it capitalism they were leading you toward?
Yeah, so I that was probably in an article I wrote, probably for Geo. Yeah, so, one of the things, one of my particular interests in the co-op world are the cooperative movement in northern Italy. And part of the reason is because when I was in school, I took a, class in development economics, and I remember there's this chart that they show you, and it's the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, and then a economic development measure of some sort on the other axis. And I remember the teacher just being emphatic that that inequality must increase as a country or region becomes more successful economically. It just naturally happens. It has to happen that wealth is more unequally distributed. I mean, it's one of the costs of development. And I remember just thinking,
let me understand this.
Yeah.
So he's saying to you in the class that as the economics increase, as more wealth happens.
Yeah. Right. So it was a development economics class. So he was talking about developing countries. So he says,
but you're just naturally going to have some people with lots of money and more people with less money. So this divide happens naturally.
Yeah, that was more or less the thing. The chart, there's like a X1 axis, x-axis, like and then it's just this diagonal that goes up. So the more the country develops, the higher the level of inequality. That's just kind of a fact, right? And I thought, well, that's kind of too bad, right? Because I wish that wasn't true. I mean, isn't there a way that we could all do better when we all do better? And so 15 years ago, I started. I mean, I was always interested in co-ops. I was looking at different things, and I found out that actually in northern Italy, in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, they were very poor at the end of World War II. They were one of the poorest regions in Italy, and they had a very vibrant cooperative movement that was the preferred way of doing economic development in this region. And then they've just turned that whole sort of rule on its head, because they're one of the most prosperous, per capita income-wise, prosperous regions in the EU, but they're also one of the most equitable. So this part, this regional economy, they did both. They didn't know they couldn't do it, so they did it, right? So they said, okay, we're going to all do well and grow our economy and have high per capita income and all that kind of stuff, but we're also going to have a really good distribution of wealth. And so, and the co-ops were a central part of how they did that. I mean, it's a longer story than that, but and there's many players that deserve credit. They have a extremely efficient and uncorrupt private public sector government. I mean, they have very effective government. There's lots of reasons, but the co-ops are really essential, and they still are just a major powerhouse in the economy there. All kinds of co-ops, I mean, consumer co-ops, lots of worker-owned co-ops, so manufacturing, industrial companies, really large companies. Some of them are owned by the workers as a cooperative. And so that has had all of these really, really good effects, not just for the people. I mean, I think one of the important things is it's not just for the members of the co-op. It's had really good. The co-ops have done really good things for their members, which is great, because that's what co-ops should do. But they've also had really important and very positive economic effects in the broader economy for people that aren't members, for everybody that lives in that region. So that's one of the things that I've just always been fascinated. I was just back there actually on a research project to write a paper. I was just there in December, really on some of these same issues, because I just think it's such an important story and something that people should know about, that there really is a way for us to all do better and us all to do better at the same time. And I think, I don't know that it's not the only way to do it through co-ops, but that's the way that they have done that very successfully.
So you're talking about Mondragon?
No, not about Mondragon. Actually, about northern Italy, so Emilia-Romagna region. So Mondragon is the other place in the world where there's a really vibrant co-op economy. They're really actually Quebec, Mondragon in Spain, and Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy are really kind of the three places in the world where there's really deep commitment to co-ops and a very sophisticated infrastructure of co-ops.
So you say northern Italy, Mondragon, or the Basque region of Spain.
Yeah.
And where else in Canada?
And Quebec in Canada, yeah.
Okay.
They have some really, really interesting laws and, policies and stuff, and very good results from those as well.
Well, we have to take our first break, but I want to try to summarize for me and the audience out there. What I got from you is in developing countries, this inequality where there's some people that make a lot of money and most people make a little money. It sounds like from that definition, you're talking about the U.S.
Right.
1% of the people makes over 60% of the new money, and 99% of the people, they can get to share 40% of the money. So you get this huge cavern, this differences of wealth creation. But in certain parts of the world, Italy, Spain, and Quebec, Mondragon in the area of Spain, you get where everything rises and there's equality. Everybody in the boat gets part of that rise. It's not so inequality. Does that sort of sum it up?
Yeah, they get part of it. It's not like everybody gets exactly the same. It's not a socialist economy, but it's much, much more equal distribution than we have or than most countries have.
All right, we'll take our first break. Thank you so very much, Mark. We'll be right back. Don't touch that dial.
1450 WOL.
Information is power. Welcome back. This is Vernon Oakes on Everything Cooperative. WOL's motto is information is power, and the National Cooperative Bank is sponsoring this program to give you information about cooperatives and how they can help your community, how you can solve community problems with this cooperative enterprise. But, I found out real early on, Papa Sin was one of my first guests, October 2.5 years ago, who said, you have to put action to the information. You just can't get information and get power. If you take the information that we're giving you here today, Margaret Lund is on the phone with us. We're going to be doing more talking with her. I've already learned something from her this morning. And if you put the action to the power, to the information, that's where the power comes from. So, Margaret, you've worked 20 years with small businesses giving out money. What kind of businesses, cooperative business, have you been working with?
Well, let's see. When I worked at North Country Development Fund, we had a lot of food co-ops in the Twin Cities. So I did a lot of lending to the food co-ops, and that was really interesting to watch that whole sector grow and people really begin to appreciate what the co-ops were bringing in terms of natural foods and sustainable agriculture and their relationships with farmers. And lots of the things that the food co-ops have been doing for decades are now becoming much more mainstream and something that that regular people are deciding that they think is important too. So that was a lot of fun. I did a lot of work in that sector. One of the most famous companies or co-ops that we loaned to, and I think the first loan that we made was back in 1988, even before my time there, was to Organic Valley. Are you familiar with Organic Valley, the dairy co-op?
I am, just by name.
Yeah, so they're a really, really now really large operation, but at the time in the late 80s, they were, kind of 7 farmers, and our little small business loan fund made them a loan for a truck, and they bought a truck because they were, hauling some stuff, and so it was a very small operation, and then it just grew and grew, and obviously the idea of organic dairy resonated with many consumers, also with businesses that use the dried milk as inputs to their, packaged organic products. So that business, I can't remember how big they are now, but they're really, really large company now with lots and lots of farmers. But they're still co-ops, so they're still governed as a co-op. And interestingly, they're still, most agriculture we think of as, are really large farms, like industrial farms. In Organic Valley, the last time I talked to them about this, they said their average herd size was still about 40 cows. So they're a really large business, but they're still governed by a bunch of, really small to medium-sized farmers who are doing organic dairy. So it's really heartening to see the success of an idea like that, and see it really take off. And that's really a lovely company. They're very much a co-op. They're very interested in they really embrace their co-op history and the democracy that happens at the board level where people govern. So that was a really fun business to see that go. So we did lots of things. We did some lending to worker co-ops as well, worker-owned co-ops, and I've done some more work in that area since then. We did some small housing co-op loans. So we worked across the sectors, and that was one of the things that was so much fun, was just to see how many situations that a co-op can really make a difference.
Back to the food co-ops a minute. One of the things that I found very interesting in all of the problems in Flint, Michigan, they did not have or do not have a grocery store. Mm-hmm. And so I think we call that a food desert. That's what I've learned. Right. And so I've been trying to reach out to the only contact that I know up there to see if we could get a conversation started about getting people to understand what a food co-op is, food hub, buying club, perhaps to start, and to see if we could get the residents there to solve that problem. Because one of the things that I like, one of the values of co-ops is self-help, mm-hmm. where self-responsibility, where people in the community would solve their own problem. Do you have any advice on how we might be able to get that conversation started, to get them to understand about food co-ops and how they could get together and get resources to solve their own problem?
Yeah, well, the food co-op movement has some resources itself. There's a food co-op initiative, which is an organization that just helps startups, just helps new co-ops. And so they have a lot of good information on their website, and there's a conference that happens once a year that's just for beginning food co-op startup ones, called Up and Coming, Up and Running. So those are some, there's some resources from the conventional food stores. And then, more and more you're seeing, or we're all seeing, food co-ops projects that are starting up in food deserts and in urban areas that are really desperate for kind of staple, good, fresh, healthy food. And so they're not alone in that quest. And there's a number. I mean, none of these projects are super old, but there's a number of them going on, and really good people behind some of them. So I'd say that there's some good peers to reach out to, other people that are struggling with the same kinds of questions, because they need to find. I mean, there's lots of technical issues. They have to find a supplier and who's going to do a market study for them so they can get the loan. And I mean, the National Co-op Bank has been much more active in lending in this area recently, so they're a good resource too. So I'd say there's lots of people in the co-op movement that could be helpful in that kind of situation. I mean, grocery stores are hard. They're really a rough business. There's only about a 1 to 2% profit margin at best. And so it's not a way to get rich, and there's not a lot of room for error. So that's one of the things that just make the projects tough. But that lots of tough things are worth doing. So mm-hmm. So it just makes it makes it important to get the right kind of technical help. So people can make sure that that their project is going to be able to make enough money to pay all their expenses and stuff. Just because it's a little hard to do that, but it's really one of the growing areas of food co-ops is this idea of addressing food deserts, because it just makes so much sense when you look at matching people's needs with a structure that can meet those needs. The co-op is just an obvious choice.
I think we have a food desert right in Southeast Washington, D.C., too. That's a whole nother story, or the same story.
Yeah.
And your role as in North Country, you would come in and help sort of put this all together when they would ask for financing first, and then you would come in and sort of decide if they could do it or tell them how to get their marketing project done, research done? What would you do?
Yeah, so I don't work there anymore, so I guess I'm not. They would have to talk to see what. But I know they have actually still been active in doing food co-op projects. So yeah, you would. One of the things you do, and any, in fact, community lender or they're called community development financial institutions, CDFIs. So the one I worked for, that we were a CDFI, but there's CDFIs all over the place, all over the country. So that's also an important thing that a project or community, they should look up on the website of the CDFI fund, which is part of the Department of Treasury, and find a CDFI that's in their area, because lots of CDFIs, that's what they specialize, is doing projects that maybe banks aren't going to do, or a bank's not going to do a lot of the project. And so, yeah, you find yourself a community development lender, and they're really often they all have different specialties, so not every one of them would be a business lender, for example, and do a food co-op project, but lots of them do. And you'd help people put their package together. So not be the developer of the project, but when you're a lender like that, or a small business, particularly a community-based lender, you just what are some companies other people have used for market studies, or who's been really successful in this way, or and you see a lot of projects, and you say, what you really need to look at is this particular thing or that particular thing, because that's where other people have had trouble. And so I think it's always really helpful to have that kind of community-based, a CDFI lender in these kinds of projects, because they just have a much more kind of different orientation than most banks. Not all banks. Some banks have a really good community orientation too, but the CDFIs, because they're nonprofits, and they tend to have staff people who come out of community organizing and community development, and kind of have the sort of skills and patience to work with projects that are maybe not really standard kinds of projects.
Skill and patience, yes. Okay,
yep.
I like that. As a matter of fact, NCB Capital Impact, I think they call themselves Capital Impact Partners now.
Uh-huh.
They did a lot of work in Detroit. They're a national CDFI.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Back at the principles, the co-op principles, you hit on one of them, and that's volunteer and open membership, which is one of the reasons that women could be so much involved in the early co-ops and the co-ops today. And we had a lady on a couple of weeks ago talking about credit unions and why there are more women leading credit unions. They're smaller, for one, and she said a lot of men would probably go to other things, and so women can end up getting there. But the volunteer and open membership is open to all people, regardless of their gender or social, racial background, political affiliation, or religious. There isn't sort of a discrimination in the cooperative principles. So that's one of the reasons I like co-ops. And being an African American, I have experienced racism firsthand. So get into an organization that doesn't discriminate. I like that a lot. And then democratic member control. And you mentioned that already. It's the second principle. We have to take our second break.
Okay.
Margaret, we'll be right back. We'll get the weather, the news. And if anyone out there would like to have a question of Margaret or a comment, call 1-800-450-7876. We'll be right back.
1450 WOL.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oaks, Everything Cooperative. Margaret Lund is our guest this morning. I want to correct something I said earlier, Margaret. I said that I did the research, or with some research that I should say I received some research, and I give a shout out to Pat Thornton. She's the one that does the research. So I received research from her, and one of the things that she found was that in one of your papers, you posed the questions, if co-ops are so great, why aren't there more of them?
Right.
And I would like for you to talk about that a bit, because that's been a question we've been doing this show for 2.5 years, and that's a question that I used to ask. And I had it, I'll just tell you what my first premise was, that the wealthy people did not want everyday people to know about co-ops, because if they did, then everyday people would do co-ops and the profit would go to them and not to the folks with the money. And I said at one time on a program, and I was told that I was being cynical. I think that's still a part of it, but I have since learned that there are other reasons. So I'd like for you to talk about that. Why aren't there more that are so great?
Well, that is a great question, and it's a question that people like you and me ponder all our lives, because they are great. So why aren't they more? Why aren't there more? And so that's one of the reasons why I keep wanting to go back to these places in the world where there are a lot, so we can say, well, what do they have that we don't have, or can we do it in our own way? In some, And that's in fact, that's one of the reasons why I study northern Italy so much, because all people that love co-ops, they all love Mondragon, because that's kind of the most pure example of in Spain of there just being tons and tons of co-ops and it being really great. But it's in the, as you said, the Basque region. The people Mondragon, they're language minorities, and they have a very tight community, and so it's kind of hard to say in America. I mean, we're kind of the opposite of that. We're proud of our diverse community. So we don't all speak the same language, and we don't all come from the same place. And so how do we do it here? That's a good question. So that's one of the reasons why I like studying northern Italy, because that is a much more of an example of a cooperative region operating within a much larger, much more kind of capitalist economy. So they don't have they speak the same language as everybody else. It really is something that people have decided to do a certain way in their part of the country, as opposed to having other reasons that they're always off doing their own thing. But anyway, so why aren't there more? I think a lot of it has to do. I mean, I think it's a little hard in America because we have such a shared sense of kind of individualness, individual achievement, and I think that's a little bit of a cop-out, because I think, on the other hand, there are lots of examples in America of us being able to do collective action really well. I mean, one of, I think the best things, if you travel other places in the world, one of the really best things about America are national parks. I mean, they're huge and they're beautiful, they're stunning, and they're owned by everybody, together, and those are obviously public holdings, but still, it's some way that we say we as Americans believe that the best way to hold that really valuable asset is to hold it together for all of us and for next generation. And so I think we can do it in America. I think we just don't really think about, in business about it. Like, we think about it in other ways, but we don't think about it in business. So I think we need to. Like, that's one of the reasons. The last trip I just made with a colleague of mine, Matt Hancock, we're writing a book about the co-ops in northern Italy. And one of the things we really, came down on is they in that economy where it works really well, where they have lots of co-ops, they really have a different sense of what ownership means than we tend to. And then I think not just we in America, but people in kind of, more market capitalist, investor-centric economies, tend to think about ownership. Like, if I own something, it's mine, and I get it, and I get to extract all the value out of it because it's mine. And they really look at ownership as a stewardship. They say that if I own, for example, a business, there's lots of worker co-ops. And in fact, this actually happened to me at a research trip about 15 years ago to Italy. So there are these workers, and they own this business, and it's super successful. It's really valuable. And, in America, you'd say, why don't you sell your business, right? Because then you could take all your money and go buy a big house or something, right? So I asked them, I said, well, okay, so what keeps you guys from selling this business? Because it's obviously really successful and you can make a lot of money. And they just, they look at me like that's the stupidest question.
Absolutely crazy. Okay.
They never heard. Okay. And they said, well, where would my children work if I sold the business? Where, it would go away. Where would my kids work? And that was really, that really told me, like, how they look at ownership. They look at, certainly they own the businesses, and they're absolutely the owners, and they make all the decisions about this business. So it's not a fake co-op or anything. It's a private enterprise that's owned by the people who work there, but they really see that ownership. They see that their responsibility certainly is to get a good living, and everybody, I mean, they have a very healthy economy, so people are making a good living, but they really see their responsibility as they're stewarding this asset, at this period of time for the future, and for somebody else to have a job. So they have a job now, and it's a really good job, but their responsibility is to, make sure somebody else gets a really good job too. And that, I think, is a really key difference in how people that are really successful in co-op economies think about ownership and the way that we tend to think about ownership.
That came the first time I heard of that, and I didn't put it in the context that you're talking, but Jim Jones from NASCO, the student housing co-ops, North American student housing co-ops, was telling the story of how the students would save money for the future. They're only going to be there for a max of 4 years. So when they put money aside to fix the roof or the windows or even to buy another house, they know they're doing it for future generation, and that's that stewardship you're talking about. Exactly. And I thought that was awesome when I heard him talk about that, and that was probably 2 years ago, but never put it in the context of stewardship, how we are helping in keeping these assets for future generations.
Right. So ownership means stewardship. It's like a responsibility. That's kind of how people think of it. Like it's just what it means to them. So that's what I feel like we need in the co-op movement to be advertising this idea that that in co-ops we think ownership is stewardship for the future, and that really people can be proud of that. I mean, the work that Jim Jones and the other people at in the student housing co-ops. I mean, if you look in America at a sector that has worked generation after generation, that's one of them. They literally help generation after generation of students find affordable housing that's safe, and we as the co-op movement get a lot of good leaders out of that particular sector because they're they're training young people. So it's super valuable to all of us. So that's what I think is really one of the differences. We need to think differently and talk differently about what ownership means.
Well, cooperative enterprises build a better world is ICA's motto, and this is an example of if we build a better world, if we can think of ownership as stewardship and in preserving that ownership, those assets for future generations. So you make different decisions. They're not short-term return on investment. When I got my MBA, it looks like all decisions were what gives you the shareholders the best return on investment, the shareholder model, your market capitalistic shareholder model. And that always is not the best choice for the local community, our national community, and definitely not necessarily the best for the world. I like this a lot. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so, and that's just, we think it, because we get taught, maybe you got taught in school about, well, that's how you have to do it. Like, that's how economies work is, there are these shareholders. But, co-ops also talk a lot about stakeholders. And so if there's no reason that you have to manage everything on a quarterly basis. I mean, that's not like a natural law, it's not gravity or something. Somebody decided that, and we can decide something else. We could say, yeah, I'm managing for stakeholders, and my stakeholders, maybe some of them haven't been born yet, or maybe they're kids that are going to have their first job. Maybe that's who my stakeholder is, and so I need to manage, my enterprise for that person and for the people after that. So I think the more we kind of like talk about that as a alternate and completely rational business-like way to organize our economy, I think the better that is, because it is very rational. I mean, it works. It's not, it's not a silly system. It makes things work, so you don't have to rebuild them every generation or whatever. You have an asset that is valuable to generations. So I think that's really important. I think another thing that's really important that we could do better, and that you see a lot of in these economies that have very successful cooperative sectors, is they work together a lot. So they don't just think about their own members. They really think about their whole movement as something to be stewarded. So there's sort of an internal-looking orientation, but then there's also an external orientation. And so that gets to the cooperation among co-ops, which of course is a
sixth principle.
Yeah,
right?
But they really take that really far, and they take it in a really structured way, so that like in northern Italy, I mean, there's not just, in fact, there were three. They just merged, but there wasn't just like one NCBA, one head organization in the country. There were three different ones. There's so many co-ops, and they're so active that they have all of these associations of co-ops. So if you were in a housing co-op, for example, in a city, you would be a member of your citywide housing co-op organization, your statewide housing co-op organization, and your federal housing co-op organization, and then you'd also be a member of your like Washington, D.C., all kind of co-op organization. And, so they are organized at all of these levels, both along sector and geography, both of those things, because you kind of get different things out of both of those. And they look at, so it's kind of a little more than cooperating on co-ops is a nice thing. They actually really look very hard to do business together, for example, and for ways to not just do it sort of charitably, but to say what is a really strategic thing that we could collaborate on that would be great for all of our members. And so, that really makes a big difference, and it really helps the co-op sectors with different levels of expertise help others. Like I remember just a couple years ago, I was in Quebec and I was working on a project that was studying home care co-ops. So they're co-ops of workers that go and take care of like elderly people or disabled people in their homes. And those co-ops in Quebec are organized. They call them solidarity co-ops. They're really multi-stakeholder co-ops. So some of the members are workers, but some of the members are also what they call supporter members from the community. And so I said, well, like who are your supporter members? Like who would that be that you would have in your co-op being on the board? And they say, oh, we always get somebody from the credit union because they'll send us somebody that's got some financial expertise and stuff. And so it was just a great example of the co-op sectors working together, like being on each other's boards so that the person, with finance skills can be on a board of where the workers maybe don't have those skills, but then they have other skills that, that can use someplace else. So I think we could do a lot better job of of working structurally together, having the different kinds of co-ops think about, really good ways that we can work together and share what, our expertise in different areas or our contacts in different areas. So that's something also you see, and that I think we could do better. You see that we're in successful co-op economies, and you see that sometimes here, but not, I don't think, as consistently.
Definitely not consistently. There are a lot of reasons why there are not more co-ops, I think, and you've hit on a couple of them. But there's another one that I found is that they're hard work. They just don't happen. You have to stay at it. You have to get educated, and that's the fifth principle: education, training, information. And some people don't want to do the work. The other thing I have found out is, and I see in your reading you've talked about it, is that you said memberships attempt to hijack the co-op for their own personal or political reasons, or you get two warring factors. I found that in the housing co-ops, I manage co-ops. That's how I learned about them. I manage housing co-ops.
Yeah.
And I've seen where people will, what I call, they don't have integrity. They don't live to the bylaws, or they will do things for themselves or for their family members or their friends that they should not do, and they definitely don't do for other people. And that ends up tearing the organization down. It eventually goes under. So I would like to see, and I found this with union co-ops, that the union comes in and helps oversees and make sure that things are done correctly, because people do have greed, and it can happen in co-ops as any other organization. So you need to have the technology in place to make sure that they work. We have to take, the music has come on. I'm having such a great time with you, Margaret. I forgot we have to take another break.
Okay. Thank
you for all that you're sharing and that I'm learning, and we'll be right back. Please do not touch that dial. We'll be right back for our last segment.
$14.50 WOL.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, Everything Cooperative. Margaret Lund is our guest today, and she's given me a lot of information. I'm learning a lot. I love that. Margaret, in the research that Pat did, you talk about peer advisory, and this sort of peer training is one of the reasons that co-ops work. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, that just starts from an observation I had early in my career when I was being a small business lender and going out to small food co-ops, often in rural areas. So they'd be out by themselves, like there wouldn't be a lot of other co-ops like them around them. And I would look at their financial statements, and I might say, "Oh, I really think you should do this or that," and nobody would pay any attention to me at all. But if I said, "Why don't you call, this other food co-op that's like yours? They do really well at this thing. Maybe you should call them and see how they do it." And that was much more successful. So, and I think that that's really natural. I don't think that's just food co-op managers. I think everybody, people really learn a lot better from and about many different things from peers. So they want to look at something or someone that's been in their same situation that understands where they're coming from, and then they see that person being successful, and then they say to themselves, maybe I could be successful too. So you turn off the complaining about like this will never work, and you think, well, they could do it, maybe I could do it. So I love peer training in lots of ways. I just think it makes sense for people. So, and even on some of the things you were talking about, when co-ops go rogue, when they go bad, somebody, they're just out there for their own, kind of taking advantage of a loose situation for their own gain or whatever. I mean, the way that, at least, I mean, on one hand, people can be people, and you'll always have greedy people, and you can't really screen for them necessarily.
You only find it out when it happens, yes.
Yeah, although I guess you can do some good screening. But one of the things that really, like, lots and lots of people react to peer pressure. And so if you create a situation where it's clear and it's above board that everybody's doing the right thing, then people get more embarrassed about doing the wrong thing. And that's also, I think, an important kind of peer education that we could do a lot more in the co-op. So part of it is peer education and sort of problem solving, but part of it, I think, is also just I think co-ops are more successful when they aren't, off by themselves. Then they become much more susceptible to some rogue board member kind of doing the wrong thing. If they're meeting together all the time, if people on a board have exposure to lots of board members of really functional co-ops, that makes them think, well, we could be like that. We don't have to be that. We can be like those guys that are super successful. So I think that's something that we can do a lot better, is this idea. And that's actually one of the reasons, too, why I kind of like this idea in Quebec that they have, they aren't majority members or anything, but they have some other co-op people on the boards of other co-ops. So that's just another way to have somebody sitting at that meeting and saying, well, I have exposure to a whole different sector where we do governance in this way, and it works really well. And I think it helps, it kind of create that discipline that makes a good co-op, kind of a discipline of how you operate without, reference to a particular person, so they don't get something just because they're on the board, that there's a rule and a policy about how different, and that's an equitable policy. Yeah, so I think there's lots of ways that, it's, nothing's magic, like everything's a combination of things, but I think the more that we're kind of, clear and transparent, and the more that we encourage good practice for everybody, and that becomes something everybody knows, so they know their peers are all behaving right on their board, so I better behave right on my board too. That makes people feel guilty, but also just have an example of what it means. Like, what am I supposed to do as the board president? And then, if they have a friend or they have regular meetings with other board presidents, and then, then they figure out, okay, like I should be like that person, or I wish my co-op was like that. How could I make that happen in my world, in my neighborhood, or my housing co-op, or whatever?
Well, the Potomac Association of Housing Co-ops, it's a local group, handles D.C., Maryland, Virginia, are having their 40th annual meeting in Norfolk, Virginia, April 28th through the 30th. And their motto is a celebration of 40 years of educating members. And what I like when I go to these kinds of events is you see peers teaching peers. You get presidents together or treasurers together, and how do you solve this problem? How do you solve that problem? And a lot of the training happens in the hallways, not where people are talking to each other or at the lunches. So they can have these conversations. But I think it would be great if we would have this peer overseeing kind of a thing. If you had some kind of way of having a group where, all of the housing co-ops in D.C. belongs to, and they kind of look over each other and advise each other. I think that would do great to help to weed out, to make sure that this kind of greediness doesn't happen. If you have things in place where people see that they can't do it because people are going to be watching them, particularly with peers, then I think that could be very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I do too. And also setting positive things like this, this co-op does great at this,
Yes.
and then you're like, I want to be like that.
Okay. Speaking about history, I met you talking about Jessica Gordon Nimhard.
Yeah.
And she's inducted into the Co-op Hall of Fame, and that's in May, that dinner. You know that?
I'm just super excited about that. Speaking of, women's history, we're a little remiss in our Co-op Hall of Fame and not having that many women or African Americans. I mean, certainly not, the number that deserves to be there through their efforts and their leadership. So I'm just super excited that we'll be inducting Jessica Gordon Nimhard. I just think her research about African American cooperatives in America is just, I think it's just mind blowing. I mean, it's something we didn't know about our own co-op history, and now we do because she's helped us know that, and I just think that's so important.
Well, what's amazing, when I've talked with her, I had the opportunity to talk with her, she said that when she started the research some 15 years ago, that she was told and believed there wasn't that much history because there wasn't that much history known. So by doing the research, she has uncovered a tremendous amount of history of co-ops in the African American community and the African American experience. To get more information about it, you could go to www.heroes.coop, and you can get more information about Jessica, and you could find ways if you wanted to donate to her induction into the Co-op Hall of Fame. You can find ways on that program. You could give anywhere from $1 to $10,000 in the different ways, or even more if you want to. But Margaret, I'm so glad that you wrote the piece that got her inducted into the Hall of Fame.
I was proud and happy to do it. It was there was just so much to say.
How in your career did you all cross paths?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not even sure. I mean, I've been a member of ACE, which is the Association of Cooperative Educators, for a number of years. I think we just crossed paths, Jessica and I, because we both. She was really instrumental in helping the National Worker Co-op. I saw you had Esteban on the show. So his organization at the founding, and I've been quite active in that organization as it was starting up as well, helping out. I mean, in whatever way they needed help. So I think we've just sort of crossed paths by having kind of similar values and trying to do work that's related.
Well, you get a chance to meet a lot of good people in this world, and one of the other things I've found out when I've talked to people, everybody, and let me just ask you this question: do you like your work?
I do like my work, and I like the people that do my work, like you and Jessica. That's one of my favorite things, actually, is you just come across these amazing people in all kinds of situations. You mentioned Pop Sen. I mean, he's just an amazing guy. You just happen upon him in West Africa, and he's just doing amazing things with co-ops, and that's what's super fun, I think, about working. Is I just think people are amazing, and they're just really trying to do really good things for their communities, and I find that very inspiring. I'm inspired every day by lots of people and organizations that I work with.
So you're inspired by people that you meet that are doing great things, and I would suggest that you might also be inspired about the great things that you're doing.
Maybe so.
What are you doing now? We've got 2 more minutes. I want to see what you're doing and get the last minute to tell people here what you want them to hear. The last minute.
Okay. So, well, I've been talking a lot about Northern Italy, so I'm working on this book with a writing partner. It's a labor of love. And I'll come on your show again if you invite me once we get it done, which
we will.
Probably won't be for a year or something. But I'm trying to work a lot more on things like writing. I mean, and writing ideas and histories and helping inspire people with stories about others. So I'm working on that. I'm working on another writing project. Yeah, I do. I've got kind of a restless intellect. I do a lot of different things, so which I enjoy a lot. Working with, I'm doing a lot of work right now with immigrant organizations that are working on co-op projects. So that's super fun.
Well, I wanted to get this quick question in 1 minute. If I have somebody that has $100,000, what would you suggest that they would invest it in for co-ops? And we only have 30 seconds.
Oh, that is a great question. I would invest it myself into worker-owned co-ops because I think they have a really deep impact.
To the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops?
Or the Working World is a loan fund that's making loans. Yeah, I mean, one of those places. I mean, those guys are all friends,
Working World.
Tell them to figure out where to put it.
Okay.
Or the ICA group is one of my favorite technical assistance organizations in this field that works with really effective business practices and worker ownership. So,
thank you, Margaret.
Sure.
Everybody, we'll see you next Thursday with Everything Cooperative. All right, and we'll have you back on in a year.
Right.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Have a great week.
1450 WOL.